There were two churches. They both received the same message on the same day. The message said, "You are going to receive an honored guest very soon. Be prepared." Well, both did what churches do when they receive this sort of message or have this sort of situation come up. They formed committees. Church number one had their committee meet around a table and start talking about how they would recognize that honored guest. What would he look like? And they were quite sure it would be a he, maybe a he with a family attached, certainly someone who would be well dressed, perhaps in a very nice new car or even driven to church in a limousine. As they started thinking, what would an honored guest look like and act like? They thought, well, his English would be perfect, and his grammar would be just right, and everything about him, there would be an air about him that we would recognize immediately. Surely we will know when this honored guest comes. So, as they prepared their greeters, they taught them to look for this one honored guest. They were to welcome that person with a warm and honest and friendly welcome, escort them to the sanctuary, introduce them to some people who would be sitting around them, make sure they got invitations to Wednesday evening dinner and Bible study and Sunday school. Make sure they felt right at home in that service. That way, the honored guest would know how much that church appreciated their visit. They trained all of their greeters, and they were prepared. Church number two called their committee meeting, and as they sat around the table, they began to read passages from the Bible about how you welcome someone. They read, "You are to welcome the stranger and the sojourner, because you remember what it was like to be strangers and sojourners in Egypt." They read, "Whenever you welcome one of the least of these, my brothers or sisters, you welcome me." Jesus had actually said that. As they talked about how they would recognize the honored guest, they thought, surely that person would be a stranger, someone they didn't know. A sojourner, someone who was traveling about looking for a spiritual home. Perhaps it would be one of the least of Jesus' brothers or sisters, somebody who would surprise them, somebody they might not immediately notice. How would they recognize that person? Then one of the committee members said, I've been reading a series of mystery novels set in a monastery. One of the monks is the detective. And in that monastery, they're taught that whenever a stranger arrives, they're to treat that visitor as if that person were Christ, each and every one of them. Maybe we should greet every visitor who comes here as if that person were Jesus, come to visit us. Well, they all thought that was the safest and the best idea. Since they couldn't figure out how to identify this honored guest, they would simply greet everyone as if they were the honored guest, as if they were Jesus. So they began to train their greeters. They were stationed at every door. They were taught to give an honest, open, loving welcome, a handshake, to escort everyone who came to the sanctuary, to introduce them to people sitting around them, to make sure they felt comfortable and at home in the service, and if possible, perhaps invite them out to lunch somewhere. They trained their greeters, and they were prepared. There was a young mother who lived with her daughter in that city, who worked very hard to make a life for herself and her daughter, just to keep body and soul together sometimes. She decided that she needed to find a spiritual home for them, a family, since they lived so far from their own family, a place that would welcome them. So she began to visit churches. One Sunday morning, she got up and got dressed and got her daughter dressed, and they went to church number one. When they arrived at the door, the greeter shook their hand, but it almost seemed as if that person were looking past her, looking for someone else. The mother thought, why don't they talk to me? I'm the one who's standing here. She was shown the way to the sanctuary, and when she got up there, nobody much introduced themselves. They were looking at the hymnal or looking at the service or talking to each other. After a while, in the middle of the service, her daughter got a little squirmy and noisy, and several people sitting around them turned and gave them hard, even harsh looks, as if to say, "What are you doing disturbing my worship service?" At the end of the service, they stayed for just a few minutes, but since no one really stopped to talk with them, they slipped quietly out. On the next Sunday morning, the young mother almost didn't make the effort to get up and get dressed and go to church. But she thought to herself, if my daughter and I are going to find a spiritual home, we're going to have to seek it out. So she got dressed and dressed her daughter and went to church number 2. Now, at church number 2, the greeter shook her hand and looked her in the eye, gave her a warm and honest and friendly welcome, escorted her to the sanctuary, and introduced her to several people who would be sitting around her in the service. Those people who were sitting around her made sure she knew about Sunday school classes for herself and her daughter, and invited them to come to any or all of those. In the middle of the service, when her daughter began to get a little squirmy and noisy again, several people turned and looked. But these were not hostile looks. No, they turned and smiled, as if to say, I remember what it was like to have a small child in church. One of those persons who turned and smiled got up and came back with a packet of crayons and a picture to color and other activities for the little girl, which helped everything go a lot smoother for the rest of the service. At the end of the service, one of the families invited them to come to lunch with them. Oh, it wasn't a fancy place, but it was her daughter's favorite fast food restaurant, which meant that everybody went home much, much happier. Now, which of the 2 churches do you think that mother and her daughter returned to? Well, which would you return to?